First presenter this morning is Henry Canipe from Kircher Group.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be in front of this group. I have a presentation here on specification development basics to best practice. I will admit up front that specification development is something I probably have an average amount of knowledge on. Procurement, I'm actually a little better, a little more knowledgeable on the procurement side of things, but I was fortunate to be able to have a couple of folks to lean on to help prepare this information, so I'm hoping you'll find it valuable. I will have I at least anticipated having probably a good 20 minutes at the end of my presentation. I'd really like for you guys to be thinking about what you're doing in the procurement and specification development area. We certainly heard a little bit from Caltrans. We also heard a couple of comments from Steve at Idaho and Brian. So, but I would like to certainly, I think the group would enjoy hearing some of the other folks here share some of the things you're doing in regards to specification development and procurement that practices that otherwise they might learn from. So be giving it a little thought if you don't mind here as we start going through this presentation. This presentation, we've got a few objectives we're going to try to cover. Some is some of the, just the knowledge, the fact that you folks all work in different environments. State laws do vary a fair bit when it comes to procurement. Some things some states are allowed to do that others cannot. So it's like anything, you go to one of these conferences and you see something or hear something that you think you'd like to come back and take and try to apply. You just need to make sure that you do a little bit of your homework there before you get too far down there, and make sure that these are things that you can do, or at least understand what it is that maybe what your constraints are in these areas. We're going to go through and identify some of the basic elements of what makes a good spec. We're going to talk about some basics of specification development. We're going to identify a few lessons learned from some of the folks that I talked with in preparing this, and we're hopefully, again, I really want you folks to be prepared to share a little information at this time. That's at least in my, from 20 years of coming to these things, the information that you hear shared among the participants is really one of the big values of these conferences. So we certainly encourage you to speak up and make sure that you share with a group things of interest. As I indicated, regulations do vary. One of the things that we've learned in doing work across the country, and I think I've worked in pushing 20 of the 50 state DOTs at this point, is that actually you can find a lot of good examples that in your states, often from the local government or even the universities, because quite frankly, they seem to, at least if I'm making a general broad statement, state agencies tend to be the most conservative because they have, I think, a little more eyes on them. Local governments tend to be a little more, have a little more flexibility in trying new things, and quite frankly, it is helpful when you're in a state and you're wanting to do something new, if you can cite that, well, the city of X is doing this or this university is doing that, it can really help you in terms of trying to get some approval or get some authority to try some new things. And that's, of course, again, that's one of the purposes of these kind of conferences, is to share new things. And in the case of course, you all, I think everyone here heard Chris's presentation yesterday where he was talking about their Best Value initiative. That's a pilot project that Caltrans was able to get authority to do, and that is a good way when you're in a state and you're wanting to try to do something that you don't have current authority to, or it's a pretty big leap, that lots of times it's much easier to get authority to do a pilot. And that's one of the messages I think we've learned, was they let you try something and see if it works. But that can be a good strategy in procurement. What makes a good specification? Again, I know there's folks in this room that have done a lot more spec development than I have, but there are some pretty basics that do apply. It should be clear and easy to understand. It needs to be specific, accurate, and complete. And you need to distinguish between what's essential versus what's desirable. And we'll sort of circle back to that. A good procurement, the people, the vendor, wants to know what your evaluation criteria are. They need to know that information. I can assure you, as a vendor, we're always wanting to try to give you what you're asking for. We really rely on you, though, to make it clear what it is you're asking for. So a good spec should allow the vendor to understand what it is you need so they can try to help meet that need. And as you can read for yourself there needs to be, you need to understand what the function that it is that you're trying to get something that's going to accomplish, and that procurement documents should be consistent. The importance there is simply the more that a vendor can get familiar with your procurement documents, the better job they can be responding to your documents. And it does help to try to keep these things as consistent as possible to reduce that learning curve. And vendors, just like me, they factor in risk. The more that they don't understand, the more they have to include what they call a risk premium. So the more you can reduce the unknowns, the better you can get a good procurement out there that'll give you what you want at a price that you can live with. And as I think we heard Chris talk yesterday, and you'll hear other people talking, we're seeing more and more use of flexible terms or flexible issues, options. And I will be talking at the end of this presentation a little bit, dovetailing on Chris's presentation about vest values, and that's clearly some things that are more and more DOTs are trying to do. Specification basics. Specifications are by definition, they're technical requirements, and they apply to both goods and services. Of course, for you folks, we're mostly talking about goods in the sense of equipment with this group, but we also know you also do acquire services for various things in DOT. In fact, I guess the reality is the DOT, through its construction budgets and everything else, really does a lot more of services than it does goods. But quoting one of the folks that I used to get some of the information from this presentation, you live or you die by your specs, because the bottom line is that's what you live with, that's what you're buying. So it's important that you have good specs. There are 4 basic types of specifications. Again, this is, and maybe I'll digress here just a second to say that this whole presentation is really intended at what I perceive to be mostly fleet managers. I know this is not, Dennis and NCPP are developing some really detailed guidance on specification development. This is not intended to replace this. This is really for you managers to understand some of the basics when you're dealing with this, because not all of you, like myself, I was never a spec writer. Back in the day when I was running trucking companies, that was not something I had to do. So some of you have more or less background, but just be aware that there's 4 basic kinds of specs: generic, brand name or equivalent, proprietary, and then vendor assisted. And vendor assisted is frankly something of a subset of the proprietary. We're going to talk about those just a little bit. Generic category of procurements, those are the most difficult to create. That's where basically you're trying to buy a commodity in effect. I know you don't see a lot of generic categories done in the equipment world that you guys deal in, but you will see generic procurements for like testing devices and things of that nature. I know that was one of the examples that was provided to me of a generic procurement. The bottom line is that you don't identify any vendors or any brand names, and it allows the widest number of vendors to where it encourages competition. But as I said, it's pretty difficult to develop a generic specification, but maybe in some of the round robin here, which might be able to share some of your experiences, and maybe some of you have been successful in developing generic specs. The more common, and I'd say maybe the most common, is to typically use a brand name or equivalent spec. That's where you specifically identify that we're looking for a John Deere XYZ or equivalent. And that sort of helps you define the pigeonhole that you're trying to fill, and it typically is pretty helpful to the vendors. They sort of intuitively understand what you're looking for. You usually use these when you just simply lack enough information, or it's just simply too hard to try to find a generic spec. But it's important that when you're using this brand name or equipment that you do include sufficient detail to help them to help your vendors understand what you're looking for. Items such as lifting capacity, horsepower, boom reach. Obviously, that depends on the type of equipment you're doing, but in some cases, if there is only one or two acceptable makes or models, list them, but just be prepared to defend those decisions. And that's, that's, I don't think I need to elaborate a whole lot more. If you got a particular thing that you need, if that's what's working for you, identify it, just be prepared to defend it. You're going to have a basis for it. This is the public dollars that you're spending, so we've got to make sure that we're able to show that we're being good stewards of those dollars. A proprietary specification, that's when you're really basically limiting your competition to within one vendor, although there is still competition in that case. Again, going back to my example, and I don't think there's any John Deere people in here, that's just the name I'm pulling out of the air. But the bottom line is, if you want a John Deere here, there's John dealers all over the state. It's not like there is no competition. That is a competition that you just are constraining it a little bit. So there's still competition. In most states, if you try to limit a procurement to a particular brand or especially a model and so on, that you're going to have some kind of specification or justification. But that's obviously just depends, again, on your state and so on and so forth when it comes to that. The fourth type is where you literally have a vendor assist you in preparing the RFP. In some states, I think, again, a lot of specification development in general, I think you typically do ask for vendors to provide you information anyway, which at some level or another is a form of vendor assistance, but in some cases you actually ask the vendor to help you develop the RFP. In some states, and I know one of the ones that we do some specification development work for my company, Virginia, VDOT. In VDOT, if you actually have a vendor, you pay a vendor to help you develop a spec, that vendor cannot bid on that product. They're precluded. So that's going to depend on the states, but just be aware of that. In some cases, that is another type of spec that is used. Specification elements to the specification document itself. You need to have a purchase description, and as you folks can read, I'm not going to try to go through this line item by line item, but the bottom line is you need to let the vendor know what it is you're looking for and what it is you're trying to use it for. And of course, as it indicates here, the time it applies, and that's especially like, again, Chris mentioned yesterday, some of your multi-year procurements that the vendor needs to know, is this a one-time purchase, or is this a purchase where you're going to be attempting to use this same spec over making a single award over multiple years? So the vendor, again, needs to know what it is you're wanting so that they can try to help you identify and support that need. Design specifications. Quite frankly, I think at least in my 40 years in the industry, in the public sector, the whole low bid process, the attempts to try to get the users the equipment that they need to get the work done within a procurement vehicle that's really forcing you to buy on the low bid purpose or approach. Specifications were the way that you really tried to get that equipment. The problems with really having highly specified procurements, quite frankly, is the risk of you owning your problem. A vendor gives you exactly what you asked for, but once you get it, you find out it really wasn't what you wanted. It really isn't getting the job done. So that's the problem fundamentally with having highly specified procurement documents, is that it's only as good as the procurement is. In some cases, you just can't, this thing is giving me everything I asked for, but it still didn't turn out to be a very good product that we look for. Bottom line is specifications include, you need to know what it's done, any dimensions or drawing, even in some cases how to make it. But again, the problem is you don't want to own the product, or you don't want to put all the onus on the DOT to make sure they have the right spec, because otherwise as I indicated, I'm sort of spinning a little bit here. The bottom line is you can just own your own problem that you've created. This is a danger with a highly developed spec. Performance specifications. These are the sort of the opposite end of the spectrum from the design specifications. This is where you're telling it what you want to do. It is important in performance specs to have some specifics, such as you see here on the screen, whether these specs are continuous or intermittent. This is a pretty important point. For instance, and these actually all came from Caltrans. On a snow blower, whether it's got what's supposed to be able to blow 3,500 tons of snow an hour, and then is that an hour one time, 1 hour a day, or is that 8 hours a day, or is that continuous? So those are all different types of performance specs. Must be able to pick up 3 yards of moist sand. We're talking sweepers, of course, here, and leave less than 2% behind. The thing about performance specs, as we can indicate here, is that, you know, these are good things to have. These really help you to figure out whether the equipment's going to accomplish what you want to do, but you got to be able to confirm that actually the equipment is performing. This is something that I see, at least in talking with a lot of DOTs. Some of them write all these great performance specs and then sort of fall down on the actually making sure to confirm that the equipment is actually delivering what they asked to do. And if you don't do that, then you've sort of wasted your time to some extent. And this is what I've already touched on. Basically, you need to identify what that testing is going to be to confirm that compliance, and more importantly, what's the consequences if the thing, you should spell it out in your procurement document. What are the remedies that are available to you? Is it a reduction in pay? Is it a cancellation of the contract? And one of the things, and this is one of the lessons that I heard from Caltrans, and I think, and I actually heard this also from VDOT, was that have the vendor actually provide, as part of that spec, have them operate the equipment, because you avoid the whole issue of, well, your guys simply didn't operate it to where it's supposed to be doing. Have the vendor, as part of their delivery process, come out and actually have their people operate the equipment and see if it's in compliance. That way you avoid another finger pointing exercise of, well, it was an operator error, as opposed to the equipment not meeting its case. Combination specifications are simply, as you might imagine, some combination of design and performance. And I think most of your specs, at least, I think that seems to be a much more dominant approach, is a mix of actual design specs as well as performance specs. And this is pretty typical in a lot of DOTs. Other points to do with procurement specifications. You need to make sure that you're identifying some of your minimum requirements. You don't want the things to be so broad that there's no floor in this thing, so it's important that you identify there's some amount of minimum requirements, and it's also important to focus on what's needed versus what's wanted. That's always the classic challenge, especially for you folks. You're trying to give your users what they say they need to do their work, but sometimes what they need and what they want are not always the same thing. And that's the challenge. Let's face it. You got a limited amount of money to spend, and every little bell and whistle you add to that piece of equipment over time, it means that you're buying less equipment. So that's the classic challenge for the fleet manager and the specification people, is to try to give them what they need, so that we can have as much money as we can to actually buy the equipment, as opposed to having one fire truck out there to try to serve the entire state. So I use the analogy here, and I guess I'm dating myself a little bit, of the old Chevrolet versus the Cadillac thing. Well, I don't know if people even appreciate that analogy anymore, but the bottom line is, we're trying to distinguish between what everything your guys want, and you want to try to give them what they say they need, but distinguish that from the have to versus nice to category. And again, I've already mentioned the tests that are needed to meet some specs, and you need to always make sure, and this is sort of, I guess, a generic catch-all comment, make sure that all your specs include your normal requirements around OSHA, EPA, and state, and so on and so forth. But those are what I call boilerplate requirements that you folks have to have. But again, this is just, these are things that are just need to be part of your specification process. In procurement, as opposed to, I guess, specification and procurement, we can't separate on this topic, but language is very important in the procurement world. It's everything. It is you really need to be precise in your language, because it'll help you avoid a lot of grief. Recognize that in the procurement world, Shall and must have specific meanings. Those are mandatory items. If you tell a vendor this equipment shall have this and it must have that, that means it's an up or down thing. They either got it or they don't have it. If they don't have it, they're not meeting your requirements. So that's important to recognize that these words have very specific meanings in the procurement world. You got to be real careful about how you use them. Should and may are just the opposite. That's the nice to have stuff. So that is non-mandatory items. You're not necessarily not going to be selective for have these things, but those are items that fall into the nice to have categories, and maybe in some instances you need to try to, in your evaluation criteria, identify those things to help you distinguish whether you want to award additional points or evaluation criteria on these. Will, the word will in the procurement world, that is an obligation on the buyer. All of a sudden, it's you're saying if the DOT will do this, that means you're obligating yourself, your own agency, to do certain things. And again, this is just procurement language. These things have very specific meanings. And your vendors are used to working in these environments where they understand this language. You just need the impetus on you is to make sure you're using the language so you're not misleading your vendors and everything is. This last item I think actually is very important. I have a tendency, and I think a lot of us do, to try to repeat a statement, to try to, I guess, drive it home to make sure the listener or the reader understands this point. Unfortunately, in procurement, more often than not, when you repeat items, you'll change the word or change a little bit of the word in one area and you won't change it in another. So the easiest way to avoid issues of that type is to avoid repeating the same statements in the document. Say it once and don't repeat it. This is just a way in the specification world to avoid some of these conflicts where at minimum you're going to find yourself answering questions from your vendors on paragraph 3, line 7 of page X. You say this, and on 3 pages later you say it slightly differently. Which one is it? So if you can avoid repeating yourself, you can avoid some of that delay and time involved, and hopefully again help. Again, this is all about really reducing vendor risk so they can give you the best product that you can and meet your needs. It's easier, and in fact, I think this is probably true in most things. Try to adopt a standardized format for your procurements to the extent that you can. A lot of your same vendors are responding to multiple procurements. It simply makes it easier for them. It makes it easier for you. If they can find the same information in the same places, then it's easier for them to try to figure out, okay, well, they bought this thing 2 years ago, and here they are buying it again. What's different? If the information is located in the same places in the standard format, you're making life easier for most folks. So obviously that doesn't mean you can't change to try to improve to otherwise, but at least once you standard or make changes, try to freeze on that change so that you can reduce that. And avoid keep your language as simple as possible. I mean, the reality is that I think these are a couple of just simple examples of that. Rather than saying activate, say start. I mean, you're saying the same thing, but it's just easier. Pay instead of compensate. You're not trying to get a grade out of your high school English teacher on this stuff. You're really trying to communicate effectively and efficiently. So the simpler you can do it, the less ambiguous you can do it, typically the better you are. And use words instead of phrases. That's to sit here, as soon as possible means nothing to me. I mean, that's whenever I get around to it. Immediately has a different meaning. So try to, again, precise use of your language helps to reduce ambiguity. And this is a recurring thing. You need to specifically define what you're looking for. Spell out acronyms. Lord, the DOT, wherever every world, whether it's private or public sector, has got their own little language, whole sets of anagrams. Spell them out. Don't just assume your vendor knows them. Just spell out what it is, and then when you put in a parenthetical statement that this CARB stands for California Air Resource Board. Just make it easy on the reader to not to have to understand or figure out what it is you're saying. Here's some more of those ambiguous words. Accurate workmanship. What does that really mean? You know, what does suitably housed mean? Your definition and mine can be very different. Neatly finished, again, means nothing really. Try to avoid those kind of ambiguous statements. Try to be as clear as you can so that, again, you don't fall into the last thing you want to do is find yourself going back and forth with your vendors over these kind of vague interpretations that could have been avoided with a little more precision up front. And one of the suggestions that was offered that was, if you're wanting to catch-all phrase in your document to give you some latitude to make sure, include something, a statement like similar to the satisfaction of the specification engineer as a generic catch-all. But regardless, try to avoid that altogether by being as specific and as clear as you can. And I know we got some vendors in the room, and I'm hoping as part of the Q&A session, maybe they can be prepared to share a little bit of their favorite pet peeves when they're going through procurement documents of this kind of information. It makes it hard for them to try to respond. Lessons learned from specification development, and again, this is come from talking to some people who I have a lot of respect for that in this, and actually talking to you and some of your peers. Know your problem in your specification development. You know, talk to your people who are that are your stakeholder groups, the users, the people who are actually using the equipment, the shops, the people who are actually maintaining the equipment, the financial people, the people who are paying for the equipment. Understand what their needs are and what their priorities were. And then, as this list indicates here, find out, in most cases you're buying equipment that you've bought before. How did the previous equipment work? What was wrong with what you bought in the past? Is it still doing the job? Do you have a need to significantly change anything? Is this year-round use, part year, et cetera, et cetera? Just make sure you're talking with your folks, getting good answers, good feedback to these kinds of questions, so that you can at least fully inform yourself as you develop these specs and do the best job you possibly can. Not a lot of discussion yesterday, of course, but I think all of us understand that we did hear Kyle talk and Bob talk about the fact that more DOTs are getting pressured on utilization and trying to make sure that their fleet is right-sized and so on and so forth. Well, part of the solution is to have the ability to get equipment that you don't necessarily own all the time, or that you only need for temporary use. And that means that you have to evaluate as part of these decisions what it is you're going to buy versus what it is you're going to rent versus even leased options in the case of, especially quite frankly, I'm always thinking sweepers, stuff that is just highly maintenance intensive and you just can't afford to hang on to it in your fleet forever because it just kills you on your maintenance side of things. But the bottom line is just, you need to, when you're buying this equipment, should we consider these options? If so, do we want to include some language in our specifications that allow us to explore those options? I think a number of you probably heard presentations from, I know Doug Burke has given a couple of good presentations on the use of where they're negotiating some trade-in allowances that they have the option to either take or not take. That gives them a lot of flexibility in some of their procurements. And I know Caltrans and a lot of you guys are doing buyback. It seems like it really runs cycles of whether you're using buyback extensively and not extensively. To lots of instances, that's just a function of the market in your local area and the dealers. But regardless, you need to be looking at these kind of considerations about how frequent do I need this equipment? How long do I need this equipment? And how critical is this equipment to me? These are all factors that as fleet managers, you folks need to be thinking, and that's how you try to drive your utilization up, is to try to keep this big picture in mind when you're doing this stuff. And frankly, in some cases, the relative cost of buying versus the other options, it's a dynamic situation. I know I've talked to Steve over the years about he was using a buyback in a major way fairly early, and the market does changes on him. Some years it's pretty attractive, some years it's not. That's just the nature of the beast there. You can't make a lot of decisions in life that are good for the rest of your life, and this is the same sort of thing. Market research, do your homework. I mean, this is true of almost anything in life. You know, when you're trying to procure equipment like this, you got to do your homework. You got to know what the market is, what's available to the market, what options and alternatives there are. And and this was pointed out to me by, again, one of my resources here, just recognize that your manufacturers can typically meet specs through a whole variety of things. You can make 325 horsepower out of a 9-liter engine, or you can make it out of a 15-liter engine. They got options. You're going to have to try to understand the trade-offs involved. Things such as using counterweights on excavators can let that excavator increase its capacity with no other change to the thing. You just need to understand when you're putting your specs together what the options and alternatives are, and typically you want to try to create some sort of table or matrix, as we refer to here, that you can engage those same groups of stakeholders that we were talking about, your users, your shops, et cetera, so that they can help define this procurement document before it goes out on the street, and help your vendors do a better job supporting your needs. And I think I've already touched on this. I'm not going to repeat myself. The bottom line is, again, just do your homework. You know, create the outline, organize your spec in a logical manner, allow your people time to review. And, you know, to be quite frank with you, the very last line on this slide is maybe the most important line. You know, by engaging folks in these kind of efforts, they get some degree of ownership in that thing. It's a lot easier for them to fuss about it if they weren't engaged. If they were engaged or were offered a chance to get engaged and then simply didn't choose to get involved in the process, well, now that's then shame on them, because the reality was they had the opportunity, and this is just a good way of, at least in my mind, and this is simply a best practice of making sure these folks are involved so that everybody owns the equipment once you get it, that it's not a, well, look at what the guys down there in the central office gave us, you know, this piece of crap. So, you know, this is just part and parcel of good practice here. Pick the appropriate process for how you're going to buy your equipment. Like I say, we've touched on some of them. They're the low bid, least to buy, the guaranteed buybacks, the best value, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Just make sure that you're picking the process that provides you the most flexibility you can in order to achieve your procurement goal. Your procurement goal, again, is trying to make sure you give your people what they want at the lowest price that you can to the best value for the state. You know, one of the things that came up in one of the earlier presentations was that a product list can be a good way of trying to do this. I think most of us are familiar with approved product lists. They can be a good practice in terms of this, but it's also not many people, it takes a lot of time and effort to actually come up with a approved product list. And, you know, in some cases, it's sort of hard to justify something for these, you know, once every 3 or 4 year procurements, but it is an option. It takes time and effort to do that. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit now. This is piggybacking on Chris's presentation yesterday a little bit. The best value is something that, as Chris indicated, we're doing a little work for those guys on that project he mentioned yesterday. What I want to talk about for just a minute is some of you, I know in fact at least a half a dozen in this room, participated in a survey that we did of best value practices as part of this project. I want to talk about that just a little bit, but again, since Chris covered this yesterday, I will skip it. The bottom line is it is a way of trying to purchase equipment and try to achieve multiple goals. It's just another way of trying to skin the cat, basically. And it's, you know, as with all forms in the public sector, you're truly trying to promote open competition, but at the same time, you're trying to do it in a way that will allow you to get better equipment for your money. So that's part of what we're trying to do. In a best value procurement, and again, I don't know that these are all that different from some of the other approaches, but you really want to try to identify your possibilities, choose your relevant factors, decide what it is that's important to you for that specific application. You got to identify what your evaluation factors are being weighed, and Chris touched on that a little bit yesterday in the case of Caltrans. And you know, and in most states, not all, but in most states, it is fairly common for even best value equipment's price is part of the consideration. It just really does depend on the locale or the agency as to how big a percentage. That does seem to vary a fair bit. You might want to look at the bottom of this slide. The bottom line was we had a survey monkey survey that we invited several trade organizations to contact their members to reach out to. Lisa actually contacted a lot of folks in this room directly as part of this effort. We did have 35 people respond to this survey on best value practices, including 18 of which were DOTs. So 18 out of the 50 DOTs, quite frankly, we were pleased with that response. That was a nice response. It speaks well to Lisa and to you folks in the room that you were willing to participate. We were a little surprised that the majority of the folks that responded to this survey actually indicated they had best value equipment authority in some shape or fashion. And this is off, well, I guess maybe it's semi-readable in terms of the size, but the bottom line was that when we were, as part of the survey, we went through and asked them various questions about this. And as you can see here from this slide, that, low bid still is the dominant way that most people are buying, subject to the compliance with specs. There are 26 of the responses included the ability to indicate perform to some level of contact requirements. And total cost of ownership is again, we touched on a little bit yesterday. 16 of the respondents says they use total cost of ownership in terms of some of their best value bidding. Capability of the dealerships to support the equipment. Again, we found that 20 of the respondents, that was something they had used at least in some point or in some opportunities. Maybe that's a key point to pick up on here, was that no one we talked to used best value procurement for everything. It does take more time and more effort from both the agency and the vendors, and there has to be, like most things in life, you have to decide whether I'll borrow Tim Cunningham's favorite expression, whether the juice is worth the squeeze. So you have to decide whether the value is there to go to that additional effort. But at least we found that, like I say, a large number of the people that responded to the survey did in fact have and use best value at some level or another and use some of these factors here. And as we said, you can see for yourself, it was just, any way you shake it, there was a good number of the folks that were using various and sundry of the methods that we've talked about here. And it was really, I guess, we found a larger percentage of people who had these things and at least had tried using these things than we expected. The DOTs in general were the most conservative. If I had to make a sweeping broad brush statement, I think the DOTs were more conservative than the other agencies and entities that were responding, a lot of which were state and local government or universities. They seemed to be, and that's sort of consistent with my earlier comment about those kind of entities seem to be a little more push the envelope in a lot of procurement areas. As you can see, still purchase price, was a factor in the vast majority of the people who were responding, and they were looking at warranty coverage terms, as we mentioned yesterday, I think. And the long and the short of it was that we found this to be a pretty interesting survey, and I think those folks who participated in this survey should have received a copy of the survey. I did email the results out to those folks. The only thing we didn't do was identify the specific people who did respond, because they were asked to. We provided them anonymity on that. But it is sort of interesting to see some of the different things that people are using. We talked about, Doug, a projected or guaranteed salvage value. 7 of the people used that at some level or another. Projected or guaranteed design life. Guaranteed or maintenance costs, as Chris mentioned, this is something that Caltrans I think has some interest in trying to figure out how to do it, and even in some cases, even things about projected or guaranteed maintenance and accident costs. So the bottom line is it's important to know, I think the message from this is that, I think it's reasonable that DOTs are pretty conservative organizations. You're large, you're highly visible, you're subject to being, pulled and from pillar to post by elected officials, et cetera. So it's hard to want to be on the bleeding edge, but just recognize there are things going on. You aren't on the bleeding edge with this best value stuff, and it is something that we think it has a lot of promise. I guess before I leave that subject, I will mention that, as Chris mentioned yesterday, the Caltrans project is supposed to finish up by early next year. There will be a final report. It will be a public document or publicly available. It's never a good idea to talk about research too much that you're right in the middle of. I will say that some of the initial data results, the analysis to actually see whether the best value equipment is in fact outperforming the equipment that they was purchased non-best value at similar ages, the early analysis looks good. I mean, I think there's still some work to make sure that we are feeling confident enough to take it and roll it out to a much bigger stakeholder group. But some of the early results are just as in a nutshell. The equipment's in the shop list. I mean, that's the most important thing that we've been able to gather. At least our initial analysis suggests that it's hitting the shop somewhere between 20% to 50% less often than the equipment that they were buying non-best value in the past. So if those results hold up, that's a big deal. So, we're certainly hopeful in that. I do want to thank these folks that assisted in developing this presentation. Larry Sparks is retired from Virginia DGS effectively and is still developing specs. Ron Frank, he's a colleague of Chris and Lisa's and so on, and he was a big help. And then, of course, Dennis in the room here was also assistant. And again, I do want to point out that NCPP is providing some training, much more detail. I didn't touch on a whole lot of issues that, such as the ethical issues associated with this and so on and so forth. But again, I thought this was, given the time and the focus of this group, I thought maybe some of these more high-level issues were perhaps more germane. So having said that, we got about 15 minutes, and I would, I'm well open to accepting questions, but I'm more interested in possibly getting some feedback from the folks in the room that maybe you can tell us some of the things you guys are doing in your agencies related to specification development. It might be of interest to the group, and I'd invite the vendors to add as well any input they have on this topic. So any questions, comments?
So Henry, a couple years ago, our division of purchasing was really pushing us to do QPLs. Like you said, it takes a lot of time to do it. So I'm curious if you have found or know of anybody, or if anybody in the room has put together a QPL for fleet-related equipment or components or parts or anything like that. So it's kind of an open question to the entire audience.
The question, just to repeat it for everyone's sake, was the point I made about product lists. My knowledge is fairly limited. I actually did, I think some of you folks may remember the NetPet program with AASHTO. I actually, years ago, I did a review of the NetPet program for AASHTO where they had developing qualified product lists, but that was for basically highway use or roadway use. I am not aware of anyone that's done this I see Lisa holding her hand up, so maybe Lisa has some information to weigh in the fleet side.
We've done it in the past for like arrow boards and changeable message signs. I couldn't even tell you, maybe Chris can tell you if we still are doing that. But
it's a lot of work. We have done it. We did it on CMSs or arrow boards, I think, both. It gives you an idea, at least. You don't have any dark horses come in the bid that you didn't anticipate. Everything's all up front. That's the benefit. So that's the positive side of it, but the negative is it takes a lot of work to stay on top of it, and you've got to do it annually.
How about, I know we have some vendors in the room. You gentlemen care to weigh in? Because, again, I think it's the purpose really is here to try to reduce risk for the vendors so they can help you meet your needs. So, please.
Yeah, Randy Jones with Navistar, and we see hundreds of bids a year. If we have questions or if we sell something that turns out not to be what the customer wanted, a lot of times we find out that we have a mix of two bids. We have like a performance bid, and we also have low cost, and in one part of it they don't really mention something, but on the performance side they might mention something. And so on the performance, then we know that we can go to gears, and then so we meet the performance side, but that's not really what the customer wanted as a general rule for a good piece of equipment. So if you start mixing bids, that kind of gets complicated.
Well, I guess especially as a vendor that sells a lot into this community, can you help, what is a good, from your perspective, what is a good bid? Or what is it that you're, what could the bids you see, how could they be improved generically speaking?
If you stick with one type of bid, then generally we'll be able to follow that. It's when things start changing, you know, at the front it says one thing, at the back it says another, and it just,
All right. Any other comments? Again, I really be interested whether it's on the specification side or on the procurement side of their practices that you'd like to share with your colleagues. This is a, you know, it's a safe space to.
The things we found too is we think our spec writing is pretty spot on. Everything, as you were doing your slides, I was going, okay, that's check. But one of the things we found 2 years ago, we went out for bid on a backhoe, and we had specific stick length, reach requirements and everything. And the same vendor historically has always won the bid. Everybody bids, but we get this product. And he was the low bid this time. But it was weird because it was like 20 grand cheaper than from last year. And so I can't contact the vendor because it's an active bid. And state purchasing wouldn't reveal to me the model. So part of the thing I just wanted to reiterate, when you guys get your bid announcement, go over your specs. What we found out is this guy missed a reach by like, I think 7 inches, so we threw him out. But what we later found is the guy who's had all our business for all these years tried to undercut his competition to sell us a smaller machine that was at the highest end of its horsepower, it's working up, and that's not what we wanted. So luckily, we caught it. We declined him, and he bid another unit, which is the unit, which is weird. So vendors, as good as we have, no offense to vendors in here, you got to just be on your toes because it's competition. If they can sneak something in a cheaper model to win the bid, they'll do so. And it's not they're doing anything underhandedly. We meet all the specs. And actually what threw it out was that one reach of the boom, of the bucket, and that was our technical for throwing them out. So we would have got a piece of equipment that would have met spec, but really wouldn't have been what we wanted to work with.
You know, and just to piggyback on what Jeff had said, you know, over the years we have come to a point to where now we're getting exactly what we want, and it's low bid. You know, we like the Western Star truck, and we got them this year, and they're low bid. And what we've done is we've done a combination of the way we write our bid. We're not writing it around a Western Star. It's generic, but we're allowing Western Star to compete with the other manufacturers with our bid spec. And, you know, so 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the spec would say 6-cylinder diesel truck, 6-cylinder diesel engine, right? And we ended up with a bunch of internationals with 6V71 Detroits, right? And so we've come to a point to now we're speccing out that 6-cylinder diesel has to have this much horsepower, it's got to have this much torque, it's got to do this, you know, it's got to have this kind of transmission. So we're writing our spec around what we actually want to see, so there are no surprises. You know, now we've a couple years ago, you know, under a different administration, the specs was very specific, and there was only one manufacturer that was allowed to bid that because everybody else couldn't meet the specification. Well, when we came along, we thought, you know what, that's not right, because International makes a good truck, Mack makes a good truck, Western Star makes a good truck. And so what we did was we combined the specs from those trucks into one ideal picture of what they could all meet that would still meet our goal and our needs. And so last year we ended up with, we had a couple Macs, we've got a couple of Internationals, we've got a couple of Kenworths, we've got some Peets, we've got some Western Stars, you know, and it's all from basically the same spec. They're different types of trucks, water trucks, got swap loaders, you know, but the chassis itself is basically the same spec, and now it's very competitive, and you know, and we're getting a good product, and there's no real surprises. It's not something that we can't use. We don't want a 6V71 Detroit in our truck.
Thing is too, the local vendors, our local economy is loving it because now, past regime, only one vendor, other truck manufacturers won't even come and talk to us because they go, why bid when your spec's going to be spec for this one truck? So it's helped out and paid forward dividends in the local economy as well.
So one thing that's worked well in Washington is we do multiple award bids. We're allowed to do that. So we do equipment demos on many things. As an example, loaders. So we'll write the spec, and you have to meet the minimum spec to be able to come to the demo. But to your point earlier, we include all of the equipment operators from around the state to come and run the loaders and go through and make sure that it's what they think they are. So you get away from the backhoe issue and other things, and they feel involved because they get to touch it and go, you know, maybe there's really not a difference between a John Deere and a Case other than the name and personal preference. And then, so we go through that process, and then people that meet the criteria, which we set basic criteria to meet, then we award, multiple award, and so on and so forth. But that kind of gets rid of the writing to a specific vendor or manufacturer in our case, and it includes the operator. So I can go, hey, you ran that thing and you agreed that that was the best thing since sliced bread. So the demo, so it's usually a day. So we've done sweepers, loaders, excavators, digger derricks, and we require, as you pointed out earlier, the manufacturer to run the equipment. So if they choose to have the salesman come and run it, and it doesn't perform, then it's on whoever that manufacturer is or the dealer in the area. So we used to do it with our own operators, but and then we got pushback going, well, they didn't know what they were doing. So, but many times, unfortunately, the salesman shows up to run the equipment, which is not the best in many cases.
I think, you know, the message I was hearing there was that try to make it clear to your vendor what you need, but you got to know what you need. And, you know, that's...
One thing we ran into recently is, and I would caution people about when they do their specs, is be careful about what you require as a bid submittal. Just in California, that becomes part of the contract.
All right. Well, folks, again, thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure. If you have any questions, I'll be around for the rest of the day. I'm flying out in the morning, but otherwise, thanks for your time.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.